Well, what I will be talking about, of course, will dovetail right in with what Dr. Fremont has been saying. And I'm sure you've already gathered that we believe that there is absolute truth. And I think that's the difference. I think this is what folks are looking for today. And this I've discovered, the more I study, and I don't pretend to be a scholar, and I've done a great deal of study, particularly in the area of music, and I find that all knowledge is related. All truth is related. And I find that no matter which area you go into, that the areas are related one to another. And for instance, I find that people who believe the Bible then also believe that there are absolutes in other areas. I've been interested in studying, for instance, in the area of music, that people who, for instance, a book called The Age of Rock by Jonathan Eisen. It's a book that's for rock music. I wouldn't recommend the book to you. It's got a lot of filthy four-letter words in it. It's the kind of book I don't recommend. I only read it because I have to. And I wade through it to try to get the information I'm after so that I can use it in showing what rock music is out of their own mouths, what they say. But they talk about the music as it has come, say, back from the teen years, 1915, around that era, up through the bebop area, up through the swing era, on into what we call jazz music, coming on up into developing on into what we call, where they had the blues, as that has come in, the influence of New Orleans, and as that influence has come on into the rock style, and of course you know rock is a compilation of all the other styles. But this is what they said. They said that the music shows the thinking of the people, that they don't believe there are any absolutes anymore. In fact, that book says that what jazz music is saying is do your own thing. That's what that book said. This is not me, a preacher's talking, or a person talking from the standpoint of the Bible, but that book says that rock music and jazz music show the idea, the philosophy, do your own thing. There are no absolutes. You take a ride, they stop on a chord and the guy takes a ride. Do your own thing. They don't hit the pitches accurately, deliberately. They say about, for instance, one blues singer, she could sing on pitch when she wanted to, but she never wanted to. If I had some records here this morning, this is what I'm doing with young people. I actually take the records and show them by playing the music and show them how they do that. They come under the pitch and slide up to it, deliberately. In other words, there is no such thing as an absolute standard. They take chords and deliberately add in what we call dissonance. Now, there's nothing wrong with dissonance, but they deliberately just throw in any dissonance. Just do your own thing again. There's nothing wrong with syncopation. I've heard some folks say syncopation is what's wrong with modern music. That's not true. Nothing wrong with syncopation when it's handled correctly. You watch the way a symphony orchestra handles it, and then watch the way a jazz orchestra handles it, and you got two different things entirely. Because what they do is they put in what we call a break beat. They deliberately hit it off the beat. No absolutes again. Do your own thing. And these folks say, this is not me talking now. These folks say, I just agree with what they say in this area. But they're the ones who are saying, our music expresses the idea that has grown up in the last 50 years, that there are no absolutes. Everything is relative. That's not true. Isn't it interesting that God has not had to change His Word? The Bible, as Dr. Fremont was talking about, God hasn't had to change that. I took a course in ethics several years ago, working toward one of my degrees. Got lots of degrees in no temperature. I was working toward one of my degrees, and I took a course in ethics. And the place where I was going to take the course at the college, the pastor of the church that I was working with had taken the very same course with the very same textbook 5 years before. The textbook, I think, was $12. And I said to myself, boy, this is great. I don't have to buy the book. I'll just use his. All you have to do is read it anyway. So I went in first day of the class, my book under my arm. I thought, I've got a head start on this time. Here I come in with my book. You know what the professor said? He said, I'm sorry, you can't use that one. That's out of date. He said, we got a new. He said, it's the same author, but he's changed his ideas. 5 years later. Now, you know God hasn't had to update the Bible. It's still the same. You can rely on it. It doesn't change. You can count on it. You can go clear back into the Old Testament and take the principles out of the Old Testament, and they're still true, although they were written thousands of years ago. Something absolute that will not change, that we can ground our lives on. And it's worth having. How to be happy is what I'm supposed to be talking about. And I'm coming into it. Just so that Dr. Fremont stirred my mind up on so many things, it's hard to get myself going. Let me do, I'm a musician. I have students who come to me all the time to study music. And really, this is my last point. You stole my last point. I'll come back to it after a while. But for instance, I teach trombone. Right, this last year I had a trombone choir at Bob Jones University. We had 25 trombones in my trombone choir. If I had them here today, I'd string them all the way around the balcony, all the way up, and let them play at you from every direction. If you've never heard a trombone choir, you've never heard a sound like that. At the Bob Jones booth, incidentally, they have some recordings with the trombone choir on it and our brass ensembles. We've majored in a lot of brass. But now, suppose a student comes to me. Since I don't have my trombone here today, I can't use my trombone to show you, but suppose he comes to me to take voice lessons. Students, many students come to the university, and they're going to show you how it's supposed to be done, how intelligent they are, and how brilliant they are, and how they can perform. I'm not interested. That's not what I'm there. I'm not there to pat them on the back. That's not my job. I will do that when they do well, but that's not my job. When they come to me, I'm there to help them. In fact, there's a little girl at our church. She calls me the music corrector. She's not far wrong. Sometimes I feel like a correctional institution. That's all I do is correct folks all the time. But suppose the boy comes to me. Now, the song I sang was for you this morning. Suppose he comes to me and he's coming in to take voice lessons. And I play on the piano, and he sings, "Then sing my soul, my Savior God today." And I say, "Oh, that's awful. That's terrible. We got to fix that. We got to do something about that." He says, "It sounds good to me." I say, "That's terrible. You're singing off pitch. You're not breathing correctly. You don't have any focus in the sound. We got to fix that." He said, "Well, I think it sounds good." Now, suppose he says, after I lecture on him, and by the time I clobber him and peel the skin off and rub the salt in, suppose he says, "Well, I really don't think you're right, but I'll do it just because you say so." Now, let me ask you a question. Have I done him any good? Not a bit. Because you know what he'll do? While he's there with me in my studio and I'm teaching him, he'll do it the way I say. When he gets back on his own, he'll go right back to singing just like he sang before, and he'll still think it sounds just as good as it always did. What I have to do with that boy is to change his musical character so that the way he's singing bothers him just as bad as it bothers me. And if I can't get him to that point, I haven't done him any good. Most of us measure ourselves by ourselves or by somebody else that's a little bit worse off than we are, and we say, "Well, I'm not such a bad person." But when you measure yourselves by the character of God's Word, you come up short every time. And what we need to do is to get ourselves to the point where our sin bothers us as much as it bothers God. Then we're developing some Christian character. And the only way you can do that, of course, is through what Dr. Fremont was talking about, the new birth. Nicodemus was a ruler of the Jews. He was a religious man, but he came to Jesus and he said, "What must I do?" And Jesus said, "You've got to be born again. Your character has to be changed." And my last point this morning is going to be, and I'll come back to it before we're through, the last point is that God can change your character at any point in your life. Abraham was 100 years old when God gave him the Abrahamic covenant. 100 years old, God changed his character. God took Moses, an angry man who killed an Egyptian, took him out on the backside of a desert for 40 years and taught him character so he could lead the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. And God can change your character too. You say, "I haven't got any character." Yeah, God, if you'll take the Word of God and measure yourself by it and decide you're going to obey whatever it says, God can change it. Seven principles, how to be happy. Number one, 7's a perfect number, by the way. How to be happy. Number one, and I'm sorry I don't have these written out. I thought I'd have either a blackboard or an overhead projector for you, but I think I can give them to you, and I'll try to talk slowly when I give you the principles so that you can get them down. Number one, we think we gain freedom by getting out from under authority. God says we gain freedom by submitting to the authority placed over us. Illustration. I gave it to you yesterday, let me give it to you again this morning. My children. My boy wants freedom. How does he gain freedom? He wants, for instance, we finally let him get his license. You know, he's 16 years old in South Carolina. I guess they can get a permit when they're 15. They can drive when they're 16. He's been wanting to drive. He's been pestering me to drive for I don't know how long now. I think he started when he was 14. And he wants the freedom to be able to drive. But I told him this. I said, son, when you show me that you have enough character that I can trust you with that car, and you can show me that you will drive the way I would want you to drive, then I'll give you the freedom. Not until. When you show me that you're still a hot rod, and you're going to go out and scratch off for that car, and you're going to drive it irresponsibly, you don't get it. He gains freedom by submitting to my authority. And we gain freedom, we gain happiness by submitting to the authority of God. It doesn't come any other way. You gain freedom at work by showing the boss that you submitted to his authority. The more you show him that what you will do is exactly what he would do, the more freedom he gives you. The more you show him that what you're going to do is exactly the opposite the way he wants the business to be run, the less freedom he gives you. We gain freedom by submitting to authority. Our natural nature says no, but the principle is still right. In the home, the happiest homes are the ones where there is a figure of authority that the children can trust. Children are looking for someone who will give them rules and regulations. They cry out for it. I don't know whether you've ever noticed it or not, but the word disciple and the word discipline have exactly the same root. Discipline is for the purpose of making a disciple out of someone. Discipline and punishment are not synonymous. You discipline a person to make him your disciple. I wish I could take you with me sometime and let you see. I have young people who come to me and they'll say, Mr. Garlock, my mom and dad don't love me. I say, well, how do you know? They'll say something like this. They don't even know whether I come in at night or not. I've had kids tell me, I wish my mom and dad would say, we want you to be in by such and such a time. They said they don't even care if I come in or not. They have no love for me. Discipline is one way of showing love. It's not the only way, but it's one way of showing love. The trouble is that we have abdicated the authority that God has given to us over our children, and we're reaping the tragic results of it. I read an article on Ann Landers not too long ago. I'm not an Ann Landers fan, but every once in a while she comes up with an interesting one. A mother wrote in. She said, I have two teenagers, a 15 and a 16-year-old. I've forgotten which was the boy and which was the girl. It was one of each. And she said, everybody thinks they're ideal teenagers, but they don't see them at home. She said the other night, they were hollering so loud you couldn't hear the rock music. That's loud. She said, my husband got so upset that at about 8:15 he left the house and went to a movie. Real solution. She said, I got so upset I took a couple of tranquilizers and went to bed. Another good solution. She said, at about 10:30 I heard a terrible crash downstairs. She said, I came down the stairs. She said, my daughter was bleeding. She said first of all, she said she had taken my son's hair, grabbed him by the hair and pulled some of his hair out. She said his head was bleeding. She said then my son had gotten so mad at her, he took a hockey stick and whacked her across the mouth with it. Said her mouth was bleeding, was running down on her blouse. She said, my husband says this is normal behavior for teenagers. What do you think? Ann Landers hit it right on the head. She said, it's obvious that what your children lack is authority and discipline. This is the trouble. Listen, I know men who aren't afraid of anything, but when it comes to their children, they're sissies. Afraid to make the children obey. And the children are looking for somebody. The thing is this, listen to this. This is an important point. Your children's image of what God is what you are. Especially young children. And if you don't give them any sense of authority in their home, they're never going to learn to respect God's authority either. They're going to think God isn't consistent too. The way to happiness is through authority and submitting to the authority that God has placed over us. Can you imagine what it would be like out on the highway if I said, I just don't like driving down the right-hand side. I think I'll go down the left-hand side of the superhighway. I've got freedom. Old Dr. Bob Sr., the man, he's gone to be with the Lord now, but the man who founded Bob Jones University was one, I believe, who injected character into me. I'm not going into my background, but I was a hot rod teenager around New York and New Jersey. And I thought I was God's gift to the world, you know. Went down to Bob Jones, and he started preaching, and I'd never heard preaching like that. I'd never heard anybody. And if I do have any character, I learned it from that man. But I can remember one illustration he said, you walk down the sidewalk and you're swinging your fists, you know. And you come along and bang, you hit me in the nose. And I say, good night. You better watch where you're going. And you say, I'm a free man. I can do what I want to. He said, your freedom ends where my nose begins. We must have authority, or you don't get freedom. The problem on the road is, the reason we have so many accidents is people don't follow the rules. They haven't found any way of enforcing them. But freedom comes from submitting to the authority. And this is true in spiritual matters too. We're so logical about so many things, and yet when it comes to spiritual things, we become illogical. In every area, suppose a doctor were to say to me, I don't think there are any rules and regulations I have to follow. I don't think I have to clean that scalpel before I operate on you. I don't think it make any difference whether I know where your appendix is or not. I'll start on your head and I'll get to it eventually. What difference does it make? You'd say, that's the stupidest doctor I ever heard of. And yet I've heard people say it doesn't make any difference what you believe. As long as you believe something, I believe God will let you into heaven. Nonsense. Absolutely illogical. And this is why we need to go back to the Word of God and recognize the authority of God and submit to His authority. The strange thing is, even the people who don't believe what God says still have to live in God's world. And Time magazine, for instance, in talking about the rock culture last spring, Time magazine said, it's a dead-end street and there seems to be no way out. They come to a dead-end street. They still have to live in God's world. They may believe they can take the drugs and have the freedom to do it, but they'll blow their minds anyway. They may believe they can enter into the illicit sex and have free love and free sex, but they'll end up with the VD anyhow and the illegitimate babies. They still have to live in God's world and follow God's rules. I could go out to the tallest building here in Boston today and say, I'm going to jump off the top and I don't believe I'll get hurt when I hit the bottom. And I could believe that all the way down. But I'm still living in God's world, and no matter what I believe, God's rules are still there, whether I want to believe them or not. And we must recognize God's authority over our lives if we're ever going to be happy. It's the first principle. Principle number 2. Learn to accept yourself as God has made you. Learn to accept yourself as God has made you. By the way, this is a key in helping teenagers. If you want to help teenagers, learn that one principle. If you like teenagers, as I do, and you want to help them, learn that one principle. Learn to teach them to accept themselves. I had a girl in my office not long ago, and she came in to talk about some particular problems, and I said to her, let me ask you a question. After we talked for a while, I said, let me ask you a question. She said, all right. I said, what don't you like about yourself? She said, what do you mean? I said, just tell me. There's something about yourself that you don't like. Tell me what it is. She said, all right, it's my nose. I said, what's the matter with your nose? She said, it's too big, can't you see? I said, to be honest with you, no, I think your nose looks perfectly all right. But that was a problem to her. I said, let me ask you, who made your nose? She just looked at me kind of strangely. What do you mean? I said, who made your nose? She said, well, never thought about it, but I guess God did. I said, you're mad at God because of the way He made your nose, aren't you? You see, if you're unhappy with the creature, you're unhappy with the Creator. Now, talk about things you can't change. I'm not talking about things over which you have control. I'm talking about things you can't change. And if you'll try this with teenagers, you'll be amazed at what they tell you. They look in that mirror and they say, "Oh, God made that?" And the thing is, the reason they're unwilling to surrender to God is that they say, now, if I surrender to God, He goofed me up the first time, and He'll really goof me up the second time. One of the most important principles to learning to be happy is to learn to accept yourself just like you are and don't try to be something else. Learn to accept yourself. This same girl, I began to probe a little further, and I found out it wasn't just the nose. I said, "Let me ask you, what about your parents? How's your relationship with your parents?" She says, "It's terrible." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She says, "I hate my mother." "Oh," I said, "let me ask you a question now." She said, "All right." I said, "Who gave you those parents?" She says, "No, well, now what do you mean?" I said, "Who gave you the parents? You didn't have any control over it, did you?" "Oh," she said, "That's obvious." She said, "God gave me those parents. I'm adopted." "Oh," I said, "That's very interesting. Those people adopted you so they could make life miserable for you, didn't they? They just weren't happy enough, living like they were. They took you in so they could just make life miserable for you." She said, "Well, no, I guess not." I said, "Let me ask you a question. Have you ever told your mother you love her?" She said, "I never could tell my mother I love her." I said, "If you don't, you're disobeying God because God commanded you to obey and to love your parents. Learn to accept the situation which God has put you." Most of us figure that if we can just get out from under this situation, man, if I just wasn't born into that family, that's what's the problem with me, it's heredity. Or it's my environment. This is talk about modern psychology. That's what they've taught you. That it's just your environment controls everything. No, the problem is not your environment. The problem is you. Learn to accept yourself just like God has made you and thank the Lord. Have you ever noticed? Write it down. Psalm 139, verse 14. Listen to it. Psalm 139, verse 14 says, "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Listen to the next phrase. Listen to it. "Marvelous are thy works." What works? Me. Me. That's what it's talking about. "I'll praise thee, Lord, for I am fearfully, wonderfully made." You go on and look at the next verses, and it says that God formed all my members even before I was born. God knew exactly what I was going to look like, and He had it planned that way, whether I like it or not. And I need to learn to thank God. Have you ever thanked God for the way you look? Have you ever thanked? Listen, I thank the Lord every day for my wife. I'll tell you what, we're not a perfect family, but we're happy. Why? We've learned to thank God for my wife is exactly what I need. If she were here today, she'd be taking down notes to help me to be a better speaker. Exactly what I need. She's the best critic I've got. And I thank God for it. Learn to accept. I've had women come and tell me, and I told you I have a young married couple Sunday school class. I had 164 in my class, I think, last Sunday. And I have the young couples come to me and they'll say, "I married the wrong man. I can't love him anymore. I used to love him." I always say, if you can lose that love that fast, it wasn't worth having in the first place. The problem is that it's not that you can't love him, it's that you won't. You don't fall in love, you choose to love. You can love whoever you want to. It's a matter of your will. And what you have to do is go back and thank God for the mate He's given you, and then do what's right, accept your responsibility. Number 3. I'm going to take over my time too. No, I'll go quickly. All right, number 3. God is not so nearly concerned with how people treat you as He is in how you respond to the treatment. Let me say it again. God is not nearly so concerned with how people treat you as He is in how you respond to the treatment. That's coming back to that idea of environment again, of course. It's not your environment. Have you ever noticed? Think back to your own life. Sometimes when you should have been the most miserable is when you were the happiest. Back when you didn't have anything and you were having to struggle. And you have to budget your income just to get enough food on the table. When I went to the Eastman School of Music the last time, when I went back to do my graduate work, we had 2 children, and I worked nights at Kodak from 11 at night till 7 in the morning, went to school all day long. And we were really so poor we couldn't pay attention. I mean, they talk about, I heard a fellow say, he said, we were so poor we had dried apples for breakfast, drank hot water for dinner, and let them swell for supper. Do you know what? Those were some of the happiest days of our lives. Some of the happiest days of our lives. Because it isn't your environment, it's what you are down inside and whether you know whether you're doing right or not. And God's not concerned with your environment, He's concerned with what you are and how you respond to your environment. One point on this, and I'm going to go on. I have something which I call, it isn't mine, but it's just a principle. I call it an emotional stranglehold. You know what an emotional stranglehold is? If you have not forgiven someone for something which they have done to you, you are emotionally tied to that person until you do forgive them. Your bitterness will not hurt them one single bit, but it'll kill you. You go to a new job and get dissatisfied with the boss at the old job, you'll never be as effective at your new job as you should be until you've forgiven the old boss for those things you thought he did wrong to you. It's an emotional stranglehold. It literally ties you emotionally to that person until you get it fixed. When God says we need to learn to forgive as He forgives us, He meant it. It's a principle for happiness. Number 4, you never gain loyalty to yourself by encouraging disloyalty in others. You never gain loyalty to yourself by encouraging disloyalty in others. Some folks think that they have to tread over everybody and walk up the ladder of stepping on everybody to get to the place they want to be. You don't encourage loyalty to yourself. I talked to a doctor who was a chief of staff down in Florida, and he said one time his chief nurse, his head nurse, was going to quit her job, and another nurse who had been working under, who really should have been the one who got promoted to the new job, came to him and said, I believe I'm the one that's ready for that job. And he said, I'm sorry. He said, you're not the one. She said, well, why not? He said, because you have been disloyalty to that woman when she was over you. And he said, I wouldn't trust you in the job. You'll be disloyal to me just like you were to her. Listen, if you find a man who's not loyal to his wife, don't hire him. He'll be disloyal to you too. I don't know whether you've ever thought about it or not. The 10 Commandments are all involved with character. Do you ever realize that? Wish I had time to go through the whole 10 Commandments to show you they're involved with character. The Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, are all involved with Christian character. The fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22 and 23, are all involved with character. First commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. What's God asking for? Our loyalty. Loyalty. Absolute loyalty. Loyalty is the thing you can't find these days. People who will be loyal to you and loyal to their responsibility. But God says that's the first thing you got to have character. Number 5, you do not have to respect the one in authority over you. You do have to obey him. Say that again. You do not have to respect the one in authority over you. You do have to obey him. Now, it would be good if you respected him too. But whether you respect him or not, you are obligated to obey. We have been inundated with a philosophy that I only obey the laws which I like. No, sir. If it's law, you obey. You don't have to respect that policeman, but you are obligated to obey him. You say, well, I saw him speeding yesterday. He'll still give you a ticket and you'll still have to pay the fine. You don't have to respect him, but you're obligated to obey. You need to learn, I think we need to learn the principle of a creative alternative. You say, what's a creative alternative? When someone has given you something and you think it's absolutely wrong, what you do then is you present to that person a creative alternative and then leave with him the choice of deciding. It's perfectly illustrated in the first chapter of the book of Daniel, where Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, came to the prince of the eunuchs and they said, we don't want to eat that king's meat and that king's wine. We don't believe it's right. Hebrew custom, whatever the meat was and whatever it was, they said, we don't believe we ought to have that. But Daniel didn't say, now, we're spiritual people and we're just not going to touch it. He said, I'll tell you what you do. He said, you try us out, feed us pulse and water, and see if we're not better off than the guys you're feeding the other stuff. He gave him a creative alternative. You have to try to decide the motive of the person who's over you and find out why he's commanded you to do what he's done. But you leave the choice with him. Number 6. You don't find happiness by looking for it. You stumble across it on the road to duty. You don't find happiness by going out and looking for it. You stumble across it on the road to duty. There are 2 abilities which every one of us need to develop. Number 1 is responsibility. Number 2 is dependability. 2 abilities that we need to develop. Did you know that love is responsibility? Whenever you say you love someone, you accept the responsibility for that person. What our generation wants is love without any responsibility. No, sir. A boy who says he loves a girl and then he steals her purity doesn't really love her. He's lying when he says he does. Because if he did love her, he would take on the responsibility for her welfare. Love is responsibility. When God told us he loved us, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he took on the responsibility to give his son, that he gave his only begotten son. He took on the responsibility on himself to provide salvation for us. Love is responsibility. Freedom is responsibility. The only way you have real freedom is to accept your responsibility. Family is responsibility. Some folks want the cure without the medicine. You don't get it. It's responsibility. Most important of all, I think, we need to learn to accept the responsibility for our sin. Our question quite often is, why did I do such and such? Why is absolutely incidental. The question we should ask is, what did I do, and then what must I do to get it right? What did I do? I sinned against God. What must I do to get it right? Confess and forsake. Proverbs 28, verse 13 says, he that covereth his sin shall not prosper. You try to cover it up, and God says you won't prosper. And you're not fooling anybody, let alone God. You sure can't fool your wife. She knows what you did. When I work with people, sometimes I think about my children. You know, I catch Randy when he was a little boy out in the kitchen, and he's been into some chocolate candy, and he's got chocolate all over his mouth. And I look him right in the eye and I say, Randy, did you get into the chocolate? No, Daddy. You know, a lot of us try that with God. God says he knows our thoughts. He knows what we're thinking before we even think it. And instead of facing the responsibility for our sin, we try to hide it from God, make believe it wasn't there. The best way is just to face your responsibility. And then it says, but whoso, back to Proverbs 28:13, whoso confesseth and forsaketh his sin shall have mercy. What do? Confess it. I'm learning to be a pilot. For my ministry next year, I'm trusting the Lord to provide a plane for me so that I can fly to all the engagements I have to get to. One of the first things they tell you to do is when you get lost, confess it. Call somebody and tell them you're lost. Don't be embarrassed about it. That's a principle of life. Don't try to cover up for yourself. That just makes it worse. Confess it. And then when they tell you what to do, the second principle is, when they tell you what to do it. Don't say, well, I don't think you're right. My compass says so-and-so. I think I know where I am. What'd you call them in the first place for? Because you're lost. Whatever they tell you, do. That's what God says. Whoso confesseth his sin and forsaketh it. He says, I know that my way, everything I've thought about before, I know it's contrary to the Word of God, and so I'll confess my sin, I'll forsake my way, and I'll submit to God's authority, and I'll do what he says. It's the way to happiness. Number 7, last one. Everything we do should draw attention to our character. That's my last point. Everything we do should draw attention to our character. There's a little Greek word. I'm not a Greek scholar, but I am interested in Greek since the New Testament was written in Greek. I took 3 years of Greek as a student at Bob Jones, and I've been very fascinated by it. There's a little word that's very interesting to me. The word is kosmeo. K-O-S-M-E-O. We get several English words from that. The word cosmos is almost a direct transliteration of that word. Cosmos is the orderly arrangement of God's universe. What the word means is to put things in their proper order. We get our word cosmopolitan from that. Cosmopolitan is from 2 Greek words. Cosmos, which is people, or the orderly arrangement. Polis is people. Cosmopolitan is the orderly arrangement of people. Cosmetics is the orderly arrangement of your face. What it means is to put things in their proper order. And this is the important thing. So many of us put unimportant things first. We get our priorities all out of line. The most important thing you have is your character. Your reputation should be based on your character, but you can go without a reputation, but you can't go without character. And as we said before, character, real character, can only come by submitting to the Word of God. Put things in their proper order, and you'll find happiness. If you don't, you'll be utterly frustrated. We set up goals for our lives and we think, boy, if I can just make that much money, if I can just get that home, boy, if I just had that car, if I just had those appliances, then I'd be happy. And you get it and find out it doesn't bring what you were looking for. But if you'll give your life to God and submit yourself to Him, and ask God by His grace to give you some character from that point on, you'll find that happiness comes with it. Okay?